All right. I think we'll get started. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Todd Hoare. I'm a professor in the department. I have been tasked to give you an exam today on how to write your comprehensive exam. This used to be an optional exam only for or optional seminar only for those of you actually writing a comprehensive exam. So for those of you who are doing master's degrees or have done your comprehensive, you know, the next 50 minutes is yours, kind of, I guess. But I think hopefully as we go through, there'll be some writing tips that are relevant for you, talking about particularly if you're writing literature reviews, which many of you, you'll all have to do essentially for your thesis, or if you're helping to write a proposal or putting together ideas for a proposal, which again, many of you are going to have to do even outside of the context of a comprehensive exam. So hopefully it'll be helpful from a writing perspective, even if the last thing you need to think about right now is how to write a comprehensive exam. But we will talk about how this works. So the comprehensive exam structure in CHEMENG, it happens between month 6 to 18 of your PhD. I think it's fair to say usually earlier is better. If you're coming from a field really outside chemical engineering, you might want a little bit of time just to take some graduate courses and you know, acclimatize, I guess. But it's better to get it done sooner rather than later, I think, is fair. So what you have to do is basically write a 25-page report, half of which is a literature review and half of which is a proposal to basically propose something to fill a gap in the current literature and solve a problem that you've identified, hopefully through your literature review. You'll be given a topic that you have to work on. This topic is going to be not completely in left field of your thesis, but it could be quite different. So as a student, when I was here as a PhD student, I was actually in the first year which this comprehensive was run. I think it was the 4th or 5th comprehensive that went this way. I worked with Dr. Pelton on microgels, and I was given a topic on dry eye. You would think, wow, that's kind of scary. But dry eye, what do you need to do? You need to keep things hydrated. You need to deliver things, right? Microgels are useful for that. So there are links to that, to what I knew about with the comprehensive topic, but it might be a little bit afield, right? It's probably going to be something you're going to have to go. When I was there, I went to the library. It dates me tremendously. But you're going to have to go search a little bit and learn about a topic that maybe you're not intimately familiar with. So really what it is a test for your ability to take the knowledge you have and apply it to a new problem and show us through writing and presentation that you can do that. Okay? So that's what the goal of the comprehensive is. So you have 3 weeks to write your report, and then 1 week later, your committee will have it for a week to read. You'll defend it orally by giving a brief presentation and then answering questions. Okay? In addition to the topic that you have to write your report on, you'll also be given 3 areas. And for those of you in areas that are sort of, you know, people might disagree whether they're chemical engineering or not, things like what I do or what Boyang does, you'll have at least one traditional chemical engineering topic in that list. So, I mean, for my students, we do drug delivery, so mass transport is almost always that topic. Spoiler alert for those people in my lab. It could be fluid mechanics, you know, process control, whatever that happens to be. So at least one of the areas will be a sort of a core chemical engineering fundamental. All right? And what that is intended to do is just trying to probe your general knowledge in the area in which you're doing your PhD. Right? So what do you know about this topic? And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. So you're going to get a letter on day 1, and the start of the letter is this, and it gives you some guidelines on what to do. It gives you the topic. The topic could be a sentence, it could be a paragraph, it could be a few words. And I think most of them now are a sentence or 2 or longer. So we're trying to give a little bit more sort of scope or context to the topic we want you to tackle than maybe we used to. So mine literally said dry eye. So, okay. So now I think the topics are a little bit more narrowed down for you. Okay? So you'll get a letter, something like this, from Laura. And from that time, you'll have 3 weeks to submit your report. So what I want to do is sort of go through the 2 parts of the comprehensive, or the 3 parts, really. The literature review, written part, the proposal, written part, and then the oral part, and give you some tips and tricks that I think from being on both sides, so having written it myself in the dark ages, and also being on the other side asking questions, that hopefully will help you in preparing your comprehensive. So I think, let's start with the literature review. And I think the number one thing that people do wrong in a comprehensive is that they start writing immediately. Why is that a bad thing? Well, number one, this is probably a topic that you're not intimately familiar with yet, right? So if you don't do some reading and understand the topic, understand the challenges in the field, understand what are some opportunities for improving things, what you're going to end up with is a literature review that's really superficial. It's sort of, you're picking a review paper, you're trying to mimic that, you're listing a bunch of stuff other people did. You're not putting it in context. You're not identifying what's good or bad about that work. You're not identifying sort of opportunities that work poses for you to improve on or develop. Okay? So writing your proposal right away is actually, I think, a really bad thing to do. So number one, be sure you understand your topic. And we do have the option in chemical engineering a week after you get your proposal to actually meet either with you can communicate with your comprehensive chair, who'd be someone not on your supervisory committee who's assigned per comprehensive exam. Or you can actually meet with your committee. You request to meet with your committee if you wish, one weekend. I wouldn't say that's done very commonly. And your committee is going to be careful what they say or not say, obviously, in that context. But if you're really struggling with the scope and what's expected, don't hesitate to reach out. The worst thing I think you could do is just hope for the best, crank through, and then we get the document. We're like, what on earth is this, right? This makes no sense based on the topic we gave you. So feel free to reach out. Your main source of communication should be with your comprehensive chair, not with your committee. Okay? So communicate with that chair, and that your chair will sign your letter, so you'll know who that is. So communicate with them if you have any questions, and feel free to ask them questions. If they don't know, either they'll convene the committee, or they'll email the committee, get some feedback, and then respond to you. So you will get an answer. Okay? We're not going to leave you hanging. Number two, once you understand the scope, be sure you understand what's been done in the area. Okay? So survey the literature. Make sure that what you're proposing is really significant and different. Okay? And in that context, if you can find a critical review paper, that's really, really a godsend, right? So you'll sort of have someone else that's already sort of thought about this and put some things in context for you. And three, ask yourself some critical questions about your idea in the context of the project, topic, and in the context of the literature. So is what you're proposing likely to work? So you'll notice that in my first slide on how to write a literature review, I'm talking about your proposal topic and your idea. That's not an accident. I didn't just make a mistake there. It's really, really hard to write a good literature review for a comprehensive exam unless you have an idea what you're going to be proposing later on. Okay? Because you really want to have your literature review justify the reason for your proposal. Right? You don't want to just write a whole bunch of stuff and then, like a UFO landing in a field, your proposal is on a completely different topic or is not clearly set up. So you want to, I think, before you start writing your literature review in earnest, at least putting together the text, what you need to do is look at the proposal, come up with an idea that you want to pursue, and then do your literature search, looking at that proposal, and then structuring it from there. Which is kind of a backwards way to think about this, but I think you'll end up with a much better literature review and a proposal that's also a lot more convincing. So how do you survey the literature? Well, I mean, Google Scholar is everyone's favorite because everyone knows how to Google. I think Google Scholar, though, is somewhat limited in the types of searches you can do, right? It's the kind of a traditional Google search. It also comes up with a lot of papers and patents and technical reports, right? It's a kind of a broader search engine than some of the other ones. I would really recommend you use Web of Science, personally, because I think the reason is you can do much more detailed Boolean-type keyword searches. And if you're using a reference management software, which we'll talk about later, and if you are not doing that now, pick one and start. It's going to save you days and days when you write your thesis if you are using this right from the beginning. You can actually bring in the abstracts into your reference management software, catalog them, make notes, whatever you want to do. It can save an enormous amount of time at the end. So I personally like Web of Science. It's accessible through the library website, but and maybe for those of you in process control, I know Compendex has been mentioned for those types of things as a good database. So use a database that's right for your topic. So I would do one of two things. Number one is I would try, personally at the beginning I'd do the same thing. So I would think of as many keyword combinations that would be relevant to my topic. I'd type them in and I'd collect the abstracts. Then I'd just scan those abstracts just to see whether there are things that are interesting in those papers. So just because an abstract pops up doesn't mean that the abstract's really relevant to your topic, your proposal, or your literature review, right? It just might be a keyword hit that might not be in context. If you see something that's really important, though, don't just check mark it and go on to the next one. Actually input that into some type of working document that you're working on. When I did my comprehensive, I actually did a table. So I knew I had to design a material for dry eye. So if I saw an abstract that was relevant to that, I would try to write some columns. So like what type of material, what type of drug was delivered, if any, what was the size, what was the water content. Trying to sort of key characterizations of those materials that'd be relevant for me thinking about the proposal I want to write. Okay? And sometimes it's hard to figure out that column, those columns, until you've read a few abstracts and you get a feel for the area if it's something that's a little bit different from what you're normally used to. But sort of writing that table can really, really help, because now when you're done scanning all those abstracts, you'll have a table with everything sort of categorized and what people have done in the past. And then that helps you sort of sequence your literature review and think more coherently about a topic that you want to propose. The other thing you can do is if you find a key reference, write a sentence or two about it, insert the reference through your reference management software into a document, and then try to group things with similar ideas together as you see them. Okay? So I would just start writing a sentence or two, put the reference in, and then I see the next reference. Oh, that's interesting. I should consider that. Do the same thing. If it's related to my previous sentence, I put them together. If it's not, I put it in a different section. As you go through more and more abstracts, what you'll be able to do is start to use subtitles in that document, right? You'll say, okay, this group of papers looks at this. This group of papers looks at this. I can put a subtitle here and start to cluster my references together on topics that are kind of common. And if you do that, your literature review is kind of writing itself, to some degree at least, as you do your literature search. So I think, the two things you can do, in my view, that kind of can waste some time here. Start writing without knowing what you're writing about. And two, just read 1,000 abstracts without documenting what you're reading, right? Because then you'll have to go back. Oh yeah, what abstract was that? I don't know. I'll have to read these 1,000 again, right? It can waste a massive amount of time, and it sort of categorizing it as you go can really help direct your thoughts on where you want to go with your proposal. Okay? So hint number 2, again, I think this is related to what I was talking about before. Get your proposal idea before you write your literature review, or before you actually finalize the sequence of your literature review. So I'm sure when you've read literature reviews that are published, there's two types out there, right? One is just, so-and-so did this, so-and-so did this, so-and-so did this. Next heading, so-and-so did this, so-and-so did this. I mean, I guess those are better than nothing, but it's not very useful, right? Because you don't know the context. You don't know what's good or bad that the author thought about those papers. There's no sequence, there's no story, there's no narrative to sort of take you from point A to point B to understand the field. Many literature reviews that are published out there, particularly in less good journals, are like that. Don't try to write one of those, right? Try to write a story. So I want to ask you a question. What makes a good story? Don't even think of science right now. Just think you pick up a novel from the bookstore. I don't know, do people still read novels? I don't know. Is paper still a thing? Or you download it on your Kindle, right? Whatever it is you do. What makes a good story? What makes you want to finish the story? Yeah. A good ending, okay, yeah. Good ending, a good start. Let me volunteer. A good middle, too. That's also good, right? Okay. Yeah.
Getting the reader invested in the topic.
Yes. You want to get engagement as soon as possible, right? Any other ideas? This one, ending, middle, and beginning was mentioned. There's not much else to say. Yeah. Oh.
Also show them why your idea is better than what's before.
Okay. Well, I mean, in a novel, sometimes that's not what you're trying to do. But you're right, absolutely, in this context. So, I mean, to me, a good story has background. You identify the setting, right? This isn't Lord of the Rings where it's like 150 pages to give you the complete geography of an imaginary world, right? But you still need a setting for your story. You have to put things in context. So what's the problem? What are the contexts? And in terms of, a novel, you'd be thinking about characters. In a science review, you'd be thinking about what are the key technologies, key approaches, right? And then you need a plot, right? So based on that context, what happens? right? So that's sort of the who did what where, but hopefully, if you're telling a narrative, there's some sort of sequence and logic to it. It's not just a list of this person did this or this group did that, right? There's a sequence, there's a logic. So you start here, and then that sparked this set of people doing this, and then that sparked this set of people looking at this idea, right? So there's a sequence, one builds on the next, right? A plot in which nothing builds ever is a very uninteresting plot, right? It's just a bunch of disconnected stories. You need the event previously to impact the next event. So you want to do the same thing in literature review. And then you want to foreshadow for the sequel, right? You're an author. You want people to buy your next book too. So you want to, again, in terms of a good ending, you want to have it satisfying enough, right? But you want to set up for part 2, or the sequel, or the 17 sequels you want to write, right? And the sequel to your literature review in a comprehensive report is your proposal, right? So you want your literature review to set the table for your proposal. So if you think about all writing, and this is not just for your comp exam, all writing as storytelling, I think it really changes how you approach writing papers, whether that's a scientific paper, a literature review, or whatever it is, right? Think about what makes a good story, what makes you turn the page. If you apply that to a scientific context, it's going to also make a reviewer or somebody reading your paper keep turning the page. Okay, so hint number 3 is be critical, but don't be cranky or mean, okay? So again, a bad literature review, and I'm sure you've all read some, is just a list of what people did. There's no context. There's no evaluation of, did this really solve a problem? Or this solved this problem, but it fell short here, so this is the solution to that, right? That's where your narrative comes in, right? So you have to be a little bit critical when you're writing your literature review. You have to say what's good about what other people have done, but also maybe what are some drawbacks? What are some opportunities, maybe opportunities is a better word, that are posed based on what that previous literature talked about. And as a scientist, if you do move on to academia or even industry, reviewing things will be half of your life, right? You're reviewing papers, reviewing grants. It's really important to develop a skill to look at something and review it critically, but respectfully, okay? So how to be critical nicely? Number 1, I think this is true in any human interaction, right? Avoid pejorative language. So what pejorative language is absolute language. So always, never, failed, terrible, awful, right? These are words that should not appear in your literature review because they are implying sort of absoluteness onto science, which is not absolute always, right? So use words like typically, rarely, did not, right? So did not is just a statement of fact. It's not fail, right? So using sort of those types of languages, it makes for a much nicer read. Number 2, be specific. If there's something you're criticizing, don't just say this paper sucked, right? Maybe it did. But try to actually be constructive in what you're pointing out. Why was it bad, right? What specific thing did it fall short on? What was the key issue with the paper that you identified? And in that context, one way to do it in a more respectful and narrative type way is to point out the positive and the negative. So here's an example here. So the green text is a positive. So this is for a drug release vehicle, and I apologize. My examples are polymers and drug delivery, because that's what I know. Although the release did increase over the 5-day period, so that's good. But we had cytotoxicity, that's bad, right? So here's something they did that was good, that was a contribution to the literature. But here's a drawback. And honestly, don't feel obliged in a literature review to cover every single person who's talked about the topic ever, right? There's a lot of bad papers out there. There's a lot of things that don't really add to the literature. There's papers that duplicate other people's work, right? These are out there. I'm sure you've seen them too. Don't feel obliged to include everything you read. Pick so that your narrative is structured in a logical way, right? You don't want to just cherry pick things that are convenient to you. You don't want to leave out important papers that are very relevant and important. But you don't have to include really bad things if you don't think they add value. And also then be objective and scientific. So again, based on what you've defined to be important, how does this paper meet and fall short of the criteria, right? So again, don't just list, put some context in it, add some value to your discussion. Hint number 4, I wish Boyan wasn't here, but I'm going to let you in a little secret. We usually read these the night before, okay? So when we're reading what you wrote, our mind is going to be on the stuff you wrote. It's not going to be on the 500 other topics associated with the topic that we might have thought about had you written about it, but you didn't, right? So in terms of how you structure your literature review, you can help to direct the questions that you get in your comprehensive exam into topics that you actually want to answer questions about, okay? So how do I trick my gullible supervisory committee? Number one, in a literature review, it's a good idea to have at least some sort of theory that you cover at some point. So for process control, that could be a particular control theorem. For drug delivery, there's a release kinetic thing you want to write about. Again, that should be relevant to your design, your proposal. It shouldn't just be theory there for the sake of it being there. But including that on something that you want to answer questions about, the probability is you're going to get questions about that. You're not going to get questions about the other 15 topics of mass transport that you really don't want to answer questions about, right? Use headings for sections you want to emphasize. So direct our attention, direct our thoughts towards the topics that you want us to be thinking about. Avoid jargon or imprecise language. We're always going to ask you about that, right? So if there's non-technical language you use, well, what is this? Why is that, explain this to me, right? You're probably going to get that question. And also, make sure your literature review is focused on the area that your proposal is also about. So an example in our area, if it's a drug delivery type thing, it could be a disease treatment that you're focusing on, or it could be designing a new material. If you're designing a new material, your literature review should also be how other people design materials to address similar challenges, right? It shouldn't be 15 pages about the disease mechanism and things about that, right? Because we're going to ask you about what you write about predominantly. So tailor your literature review so that it supports your proposal and directs our attention to the topics you want to discuss. And the fifth hint, I know this doesn't always apply depending what your topic is, but what I find really good in a literature review is if a literature review is about design, not just science. And we're all engineers. So ultimately we want to design a process, a material, whatever that is, that's new, different, significant, right? So instead of just focusing on scientific sort of development, if you can frame your literature review around design parameters or key design goals for meeting a particular objective, that achieves two things for you. Number one is it ideally sets up your proposal, because your proposal would be, okay, my design is addressing this design goal that hasn't been satisfied yet in the literature, right? Number two is when you're writing a literature review, the temptation is always include every paper, talk about so-and-so did this, right? If you have a sort of a design context to your literature review, what that does is it takes you out of the need to discuss at length what every single person in the field did, right? If there's a particular design principle, you can cite a couple papers that actually executed that design principle or proposed it, right? You don't have to write a paragraph about what each of them did necessarily in that type of literature review. So it can make writing your literature review a little bit easier. It's usually a lot nicer to read. It's sort of formulated around design principles for meeting a particular goal. But I will warn you, these are much harder to write, because if you're going to write a design-focused literature review, you have to understand the science first, so you understand what the design principles are, and then structure your literature review around those design principles. So you're probably going to be doing more reading and less writing at the beginning if you want to write this type of thing. So just fair warning. But again, if you do this well, it really helps to put the literature in context, because you've organized it based on solving particular design challenges, not just materials or other things. And it should lead directly into your proposal to say, okay, this design criteria hasn't been met by the previous literature. This is what I'm going to tackle, and here's how I'm going to do it. Okay? Any questions on the literature review part? So I think even if you're not writing a comprehensive exam, the introduction chapter to your thesis, a literature review that you might be writing for a journal, I think if you use these same types of principles, it'll really help make it a good read. Okay. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So I just have a question about the value, right? I mean, if you're an experienced researcher, it can be easy to see what is the value of what you're writing. However, if you are studying, sometimes it's very hard to know what is really the value that I'm writing, right? So suppose that you are not very sure, like if my contribution is very good or bad in this part of the gap or
Right, so if you're not sure what to critically say about a paper, basically.
Like if I don't know if my contribution or what I'm outlining
Mhm.
in the introduction is good enough, right?
Right? Okay. I mean, it's a good question. I think the trivial answer is to read more and figure out what other people think about the idea, right? If no one else uses it, or it's an idea that is completely different from what other people do, either it's a bad idea that didn't get any traction, or it's a really innovative idea that people haven't picked up on yet, right? So I think that might be one approach to it, and then you ultimately need to decide when you're writing a literature review which one it is, right? But yeah, I think reading more, getting more context for yourself is really the only way you could do that in the context of a comprehensive. If you're doing that in the context of writing a literature review, or for a journal or an introduction to a thesis, obviously, those are the things you bring to your supervisor and say, hey, here's a really interesting paper. What do you think, right? Is this actually something that's advancing the field, or is it just a crazy idea that someone got published? So, any other questions? All right, so I want to talk about writing the grant proposal section. So again, in a comprehensive exam, this should be roughly half and half, okay? So you have 25 pages, so roughly half literature review, roughly half grant proposal. Or project proposal, I shouldn't say grant proposal. I'm going to frame this into writing a grant, because again, just to make this a bit broader relevance to people who aren't necessarily doing a comprehensive exam. So any successful project proposal or grant proposal really meets a few key criteria. Number one is to identify the context. You've just written a 12, 13-page literature review. So you should already have a pretty good context, particularly if you have written it in more of a design framework or identifying key drawbacks, right? Doing a good critical review and setting up, okay, here are the challenges that are left in the literature. Now I'm going to go and solve them, right? That's a perfect context. Clarity. You should have well-defined goals and well-defined ways to hit those goals. So just having sort of vague goals and vague ways to get there, that's probably not going to be a successful comprehensive exam. It's definitely not going to be a successful grant proposal, right? You have to write some concrete ways you're going to get from point A, your objectives, to point B, the outcome that you want. Novelty. There has to be some point of novelty, and I want to just specify this a bit. You're given a topic that you might not know a lot about, and you're given 3 weeks in a vacuum to do it. We are not expecting you to come up with a Nobel Prize winning idea here, right? Let's be honest, that's very unlikely. But we are expecting you to come up with, what is the literature gap or a couple literature gaps in this area that I can fill by doing something that nobody has tried in that context before. So novelty could mean taking an idea from some other field, applying it to your field. It could be combining ideas together, although I think you have to be a little bit careful about that. We'll talk about that later. So ideas that have been used for a couple different things, and now you're going to fuse them to address a key problem, right? So you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We're not expecting, Nobel Prize winning stuff. We're expecting you to come up with a new solution in the context that you're given that addresses a key problem or drawback or gap that you've identified. That's what we mean by novelty in this context. It should be feasible, so it needs to be technically doable, and it should be technically doable on a reasonable time scale. So if you propose a project that takes 40 years, that's probably a problem, right? So a good way to think about this is, what could a PhD student do, right? Frame it around that, a 4-year PhD. Contingency. So, science is uncertain, right? We do the experiment, they don't work. Then what do you do, right? So what really convinces us that you understand the topic and the problem is if you identify the key things that could go wrong and give us a couple of ideas what you do if they do go wrong, right? So if we read that, we're like, wow, this person really understands what they're talking about, because they not only had a reasonable idea to go forward, but they identified what the weakness of their idea would be and some ways to circumvent that or overcome that if those weaknesses happen to be manifested experimentally. And also significance. Why is it important to do this work, right? Give us a reason. There has to be a reason you've identified this problem as being important, relevant to solve, right? Why are we investing 4 years of a PhD student's time in it, right? So, when we're talking about storytelling, someone said you got to excite the reader. You got to get them motivated, engaged. That's what you're trying to do in a grant proposal, right? And your literature review should be setting the context, should be making them excited for what amazing idea you're proposing. Then the grant proposal ideally should be, okay, here's that idea, here's how I'm going to deliver it. So I want to break down sort of the sections of a good project proposal. The first one would be motivation rationale. So answering the question, what's the problem? And what am I, just setting up the problem, essentially, you're going to tackle. And again, you've already done this in your literature review. If your literature review is good, this is half done. But you might want to reiterate some key points, right? Take some key points from your literature review. Okay, here's a bunch of sort of drawbacks we found with the previous literature. Here's what I think is the key drawback, and here's why I think it's the key drawback, or the key gap, or the key thing that I think needs to be addressed, or the thing I want to address, right? So sort of take all the negatives that you've done in your critical review, summarize and focus on a particular one or a couple or however many you think you can handle with a reasonable proposal, okay? And one way to help to motivate the importance for that is to cite statistics, okay? So if you're doing process control, how much energy does a particular process use? So why would you need to reduce the energy cost of that? If you're doing a drug delivery device, right? How many patients, or what's the cost to the Canadian healthcare system of treating this patient population? So why is it important we address this, right? And these, you can often search, just Google searches, market reports, things like that give you some of this information. This can, again, really help us appreciate that you understand why this is an important problem. Then you should list your objectives. So what specifically are you trying to do to address that problem? And again, this should be no more than one page. Often it's quite a bit shorter. So in the context of the problem in the previous literature, what are you trying to accomplish? And in broad, non-specific terms, which you'll do in the methodology section, but sort of in the broad, high level, what's the approach you're going to use, okay? And in that context, you can include a specific hypothesis or goal or a combination of them. Just be careful that you understand the difference between a hypothesis and a goal, okay? So generally, engineers don't write good hypotheses, or they write things they think are hypotheses that are not hypotheses. So the scientists will come in and eat you alive, like this is not a hypothesis, right? Typically in engineering, we're designing something, we're filling a gap. Typically we're doing aims, or we're doing design objectives. We're not addressing a hypothesis in the formal term. So I use that term just with some cautionary tales there. Typically framing this as goals, aims, objectives, it's probably safer ground than if you're saying you're trying to test a hypothesis. It's usually not what your comprehensive is doing. And in terms of the objectives, you should also mention short-term objectives. So what are you actually going to do in this 4 years that you've got this PhD student you're telling what to do? And then long-term, right? So if this works, what do I think I can accomplish by continuing this research thread for the next 5 years, the next 10 years? What would the impact of that be? So again, what that shows us is you understand the problem, you understand the context, and you understand why what you're trying to tackle is significant. The next section is a literature background. And again, this really depends on what your literature review said and what your objectives actually are. You might have to write nothing here. You might have to write a couple pages, depending on what you're proposing and what you've covered in your literature review. So the question there you want to answer is, what's been done already that's relevant to your specific idea and your specific objectives that was not explicitly covered in the literature review? So for example, if you're applying a new modeling framework to tackle a problem, you probably want to explain what that modeling framework is in this section, right? Before you tackle the specific methodology you're going to use to apply that methodology to this problem. Or if you're proposing a new set of materials or a type of material, maybe you want to write a half a page about what that material has been developed for, what are its key properties, and then say in your specific methodology, here's how I'm using that to address my problem, okay? So again, this could be a sentence or two. It could be a couple pages. It really depends on how closely your literature review matches sort of the technical topics you want to talk about in your methodology. If it's really short, you might not need this section at all. You might want to just put the background in your methodology section. Totally fine, right? So I think you can be very flexible about this. But feel free to include a little bit more literature background, even in your proposal part, if you think it's really important for motivating your specific aims and the methodology you're going to pursue. And then, probably the most important part here is the methodology. So how are you going to meet your objectives, and what are the experiments you're going to do, and why are they important? Okay? So I would say this should take up probably at least half of your proposal part of your comprehensive, because this is what you're going to get most of your questions about, most likely. Okay? So what you have to do is convince the committee that you have the knowledge and the particular plan that's appropriate to meet your objectives. And again, there's no global way that you have to do this. This is just a way I write grants and proposals, which I think is good in order to really structure the ideas. So I would make at least one specific aim, but usually there's 2 or 3 specific aims for a 4-year PhD project. State that aim with an action verb and what you want to do, okay? So there should be an action associated with it. Write a brief rationale for why doing that specific aim is important, right? Not the project as a whole, you've already justified that. But a sentence or 2 even, why doing this thing is important to meet your overall objective, right? Convince us that this task is really important. And then talk about the methodology. So this is where you go into, okay, what chemistry are you using to make your material? How are you adapting that process framework or model to fit the particular question you're trying to answer, things like that, right? So the question we often get is, how much detail do I have to go into in this section? I think the answer is enough that we understand what you want to do. So if you're trying to make a new polymer, tell us what the polymer is made of and roughly how you'd make it, right? You don't have to tell us the temperature and how long you do it and then what pore size of dialysis tube you use to purify it. Those would be things in experimental sections of papers that are important, but it's probably not necessary in a proposal. You just want us to give enough information that we could maybe not go to the lab to do exactly what you're doing or go to a modeling, MATLAB and reproduce your model, but give us enough information that we know what you're trying to accomplish by doing that, by executing that aim. Okay? And then the final subheading I would put in is expected outcomes and potential pitfalls. So if everything goes well, here's what this aim will accomplish, which should match what you said in your rationale, right? And should set up your next aim if you have more than one, right? But if something goes wrong, what things are most likely to go wrong? And what's 1 or 2 things, maybe with a sentence and a reference, that I could do to get around that problem? And again, what that convinces us is you really understand your problem, you've really thought about it. Okay? I then recommend putting in some milestones. So many of you have done sort of undergraduate courses, things like Gantt charts, right, where you list a bunch of milestones, you have a timeline, you sort of cover this milestone will take this long. You could do it that way. You could do it by aims, so this would take the first 5 months or whatever, however you want to include that, right? But just give us some sort of idea, speaking to that feasibility criteria, you sort of understand how long something might take, and that the sequence of what you want to propose makes sense in terms of the specific aims you're tackling, makes sense toward your overall project objective. It's likely that if you do this sequence of aims in that order, you'll get to your overall objective, okay? So you can do that with a Gantt chart, you can do that in the text. You can not do it at all. I've seen comprehensive reports that completely ignore this, but the comprehensives went fine. But I think it's beneficial just to tackle that feasibility question. And then significance and impact. When you do this, why would it be important or relevant, right? So, try to think outside the box here a little bit, right? Even if you're tackling a very specific problem, which I would recommend you do, don't tackle too big a problem, right? Tackle a specific problem. Even if you solve that problem, how is that relevant to solving other types of problems, addressing other diseases, addressing other types of plant design, whatever that happens to be? Are you advancing some sort of fundamental science? And then if you're writing a real grant, you have to do benefit to Canada, benefit to Ontario, but benefit to whoever is giving you money, right? Again, not necessary here, but in that context, you could still think, how does this benefit society? How does this benefit, the scientific community, right? And again, why I think it's important at least, is you understand the context of your idea, and it makes it clear why you selected the particular problem you did. So we can identify, okay, that makes sense, right? You're trying to tackle something significant, novel, that's relevant. And then you should have some references. And references don't count in your 25 pages. So I think the most references I've ever seen is over 300. So I don't know if Ryan's here, but looking at you, Ryan. But what you want to do is that you don't want to put 5 references in your references, right? You want to make sure that you show us that you broadly consider the literature and you know how to cite it, right? So your citations make sense, the papers you've selected make sense, the sequencing makes sense, and you can format it in some way. And again, there's no magic number. I've seen successful comprehensive exams with 40 or 50 references. I've seen 300 plus, right? It really depends on the topic and what scope of literature you need to talk about in order to justify what you're doing. And again, I mentioned reference management software. My group uses EndNote as sort of a uniform thing. I think McMaster actually has a free license now for EndNote. So I like EndNote personally. I know many of you use Mendeley. I refuse to edit reference lists made by Mendeley because every other reference is erroneous. There's something wrong with it. So I'm like, you're on your own. But you can use that. I've heard a lot of good things about Zotero, which is a sort of a newer thing. But I've heard that's very good. Pick one and stick with it. Use it for your PhD. Use it for your master's. Again, when you're formatting your thesis at the end of the day, I did this manually because these didn't exist back in the dark ages when I graduated. Don't make my mistake, because I spent about a week doing this. You should be able to click a button and it does it, right? So do this for your comprehensive exam too. So some tips on writing a grant proposal. Again, start with reading, understand the challenges. If you have a preliminary idea, particularly if you're making that table, where you're sort of comparing what people have done as you read papers, that's a great way to test whether your idea actually meets that criteria of novelty and significance, right? Or it's a good way to identify a challenge you want to tackle and actually build your grant proposal around that. When you get an idea, make sure you give it a specific search. So, and I will say this can be very frustrating. I spent about 3 days of my comprehensive exam coming up with a different idea, doing a specific search about that idea, and like, oh, someone did it, right? Try again, go back, right? This could be an iterative process, but make sure that, again, we're not asking you to reinvent the wheel, but we are asking you to do something that's different. I also want to emphasize, I said one way that people do comprehensives, they sort of say this modification makes this better, this modification makes this better, so I'll put them together, right? That can be fine. But I've seen a lot of comprehensives where people identify 4 modifications that can make things better, and then they try to do all 4 on one thing. And what you end up with is this Frankenstein monster that's completely infeasible. And if you put all the modifications together, you're probably going to lose a lot of the properties that you actually wanted in the first place. So resist the urge. Complexity is not novelty, okay? The complexity is not significance. Just adding more layers of complexity and modifications, generally, if it's done well, it's fine, but it can really lead you into a bad place in proposing a new idea, okay? So I just want you to be careful about doing that, okay? So when I'm writing a proposal, a grant proposal or a project proposal, I would come up with the idea, I test the idea, I then write the objectives and the specific aims. So short, long-term objectives and the specific aims I would take to get to those. And then I'd fill in the methodology, make sure that I can actually hit those objectives, or there's ways to do that. And then I'd go back and write the rest of it, okay? As if you start justifying, you're doing that mini literature review, doing the significance, but you don't know your idea yet, it's really hard to write those sections well. So come up with the idea, make sure that you can execute your idea, and then go back and write the rest. So some signs of a bad proposal. You don't understand the literature, you don't understand the problem, or we know, we could find a paper in 3 seconds that executes your solution already, right? That clearly doesn't meet the novelty bar, okay? So make sure you do a little bit of searching, make sure that it's not at least easy for us to find who you copied. I didn't say that. But you can make sure that, what you're proposing is actually different or new. Don't overstate the applicability of your solutions. So be realistic, be scientific. Don't say that, by doing this modification, I'm going to solve world hunger and create peace in Afghanistan, right? Unlikely, right? So keep it realistic what you're proposing. Give us specifics. Don't just give us broad directions. And that's why in that methodology section, having specific aims, particular rationales, particular things you're going to do, that's really important. Don't just tell us generically what you're going to do. That's probably where I've seen most comprehensive fails, actually. That the student doesn't actually tell us what they would do in the lab or in MATLAB or whatever it is. They have sort of a broad area objective, but no concrete details on how to get there. So make sure you give us some details. Be reasonable on scope. Make sure that you give us a reasonable characterization or validation sequence so we can actually confirm whether your idea is good or bad, or you can if you did this. And make sure that you, in your milestones, that you're reasonable, right? the sequence is reasonable, the time frames are reasonable. This is actually feasible. So these are some of the ways that I think sometimes proposals aren't so good. I want to briefly talk about Turnitin. So I think it is still Turnitin, right, we use? Yes. So yeah, so there's a couple now floating around. But you are asked to submit your comprehensive proposal on Turnitin. And many of you have used this before for lab courses and things like that. You're familiar with it. You will get a similarity score and a percentage. Be careful about interpreting that percentage, okay? I'm a journal editor. I've sent papers out for review with 40% similarity. I've rejected papers for plagiarism with 8% similarity, right? It depends what it's highlighting. So what's the program picking up? Sometimes it's references, and you should definitely ignore, right? The question is, are there consecutive blocks or text or blocks with a few interruptions? So one, I think, as graduate students, you should all know. Undergraduate students don't always know. Citing half a page from somebody else and putting a number reference, that's plagiarism, okay? That's not writing in your own words. All your reports should be written in your words, okay? You can use ideas from other sources, obviously. That's what research is. But cite those as ideas and write them in your own words. And you do have the opportunity to fix and resubmit this, but just keep in mind it can take a little bit of time to regenerate the report. So if you're 5 minutes from your deadline to submit, it's probably not the first time I'd be submitting it to turn it in, right? So throw it in the day before, just make sure there's no issues, blocks that you need to deal with. Your oral presentation, again, I think one way that oral presentations are a bit painful to sit through as a committee member is if you try to completely explain your whole idea in 15 minutes, right? You have 15 to 20 minutes. We've already read your report. We know what you're proposing. So use the oral presentation time to really convince us that you understand the context and what you're doing is important and it makes sense in that context you've defined. I think that should be your goal for that 15 minutes. So don't go over time. No more than one slide per minute on average. I think if you have more than that, typically presentation experts would tell you you're going too fast. So not too many slides. Don't try to get through every single specific aim idea that you have, right? Focus on the topic. Show us you understand the challenges in that topic and what other people have done. And then sort of the aims that you're taking, the objective you've identified, and the aims, general aims, maybe one slide per aim, something like that you're actually taking to execute your project vision, okay? Don't go into excruciating details about methodology in particular in your presentation. We've read your report. We'll ask you questions about it. Don't waste your time going through that, okay? And conclude with a clear significance or impact statement. We really want to just get the exam off on the right foot. Make sure that you're comfortable, we're comfortable, that you sort of understand the topic and you're confident in what you're talking about. That should be your goal of the oral presentation, okay? And then I just want to briefly talk about those general questions. And these are the ones that really scare people, right? As we give you these 3 topics, we're like, go. Now, we will ask you general questions on this topic, but number one is most of the questions you get will be related in some way to your proposal. Let's be honest, okay? So even the more fundamental questions will be motivated in large part by what you write about. So again, going back to that first thing, trick your gullible supervisory committee into asking you the questions you want them to ask you. And this questions will sort of scale, right? So they'll ask you about things that are relevant to your proposal. You're probably expected to know most of those things, right? If you wrote about it, you should be able to answer a question about it. I think that's a reasonable expectation. Then we'll go, okay, can we push you a bit further? Sort of a typical undergraduate course or undergraduate textbook in that. Can you answer some questions there? We're expecting you're probably not going to be able to answer every question there, right? Let's be honest. But if you're successful, we'll push you a bit further. So on a graduate level, can you answer questions about that, okay? So we'll keep pushing you, and at some point, you're probably not going to know the answer, and that's okay. We would be very surprised. I've never been in a comprehensive exam, myself included, where every answer was known, and we don't expect that, right? We're going to keep pushing you to see how far you can get and what your knowledge base is. And the idea is just to make sure that you have enough general knowledge on your topic that you can reasonably execute a PhD program, okay? So just try to stay relaxed. Sit down if you want. I've never seen anyone lay down. That might be a bit too casual, but try to be relaxed. And take your time in answering. If you want a clarification, ask for a clarification. If you need 10 seconds to think about it, take 10 seconds to think about it, right? So, and if you don't know, say you don't know, but here's what I think, right? So I think that's just general for any sort of oral exam. Those are good good ways to approach it, okay? So we're not expecting you to know everything. We're not expecting you to answer every question right. If you don't know the answer to a question, don't feel bad and sort of crawl up in a ball and the rest of the exam is bad, right? Keep going, because you're inevitably going to not know the answer to one question. Sometimes we don't know the answers to the questions we're asking, to be honest with you, right? We're just probing to see what you know and how far you can go. So we're out of time. So some parting thoughts. Again, don't rush into writing your proposal. Take some breaks. The worst thing you can do, I think, is take 3 weeks and sit at your computer in a sequestered room that's dark and gloomy, trying to write this thing. You know, go see friends, take a break. You can't talk to them about your proposal, but you know, still maintain some semblance of work-life balance. Stay focused.